Here is something Canadians do not want to hear. And I say that knowing full well that 20% of the people watching this video are Canadian. Canadians genuinely believe that they understand America. They've watched the shows, they know the politics, they follow the sports, they live next door. Some of them have been there. And from all of that, they've built a mental model of what America is, how Americans think, and what life there feels like. That mental model is wrong, not slightly off. Fundamentally, structurally wrong in ways that take most Canadians completely by surprise when they actually spend time living in the United States. Today we're going to go through exactly how and why, not to embarrass Canada, but because understanding this gap says something genuinely fascinating about how proximity creates the illusion of understanding. If you're Canadian and you disagree, good. Put it in the comments. Let's find out together. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. This channel is where we pull apart the real differences between countries that think they already know each other. Canadian national identity is quiet, understated. A Canadian will feel deeply proud of their country and express that pride by quietly knowing it, occasionally mentioning universal healthcare in conversation, and sewing a maple leaf onto their backpack when they travel. Loud, visible patriotism makes Canadians slightly uncomfortable. So when Canadians encounter American patriotism, flags on houses, flags on cars, flags on clothes, hands on hearts, genuine emotional responses to the national anthem, the Canadian instinct is to read it as performance, as theater. As something slightly embarrassing being done for effect, it is not. American patriotism is one of the most sincere expressions of national identity in the world. It is not ironic. It is not exaggerated for the camera. Americans mean it completely. Canadians who dismiss it as performance have fundamentally misread one of the most defining features of American culture. And that misreading shapes everything else they think they understand about the United States. Americans are friendly. Immediately, openly, warmly friendly. A stranger in an elevator will comment on your day. A cashier will ask about your weekend and mean it in the moment. A neighbor you've never met will wave from their driveway. Canadians, who are also polite but in a more reserved and formal way, encounter this and immediately decide it isn't real. They call it surface level. They say Americans are friendly but not genuine, that it doesn't mean anything, that nobody actually wants to know how your weekend was. This is a misreading. American warmth is a cultural style, not a deception. The friendliness is genuine within the context it operates. It just doesn't automatically translate to deep friendship the way Canadians expect warmth to progress. Canadians confuse a difference in cultural register for a lack of sincerity. They are wrong. Americans are not performing friendliness. They are expressing it in a way that Canadians haven't learned to recognize yet. Canada has guns. Canadians hunt, they have rural firearm ownership, they are not naive about weapons. So Canadians arrive in America believing they already have some frame of reference for gun culture. They do not. The scale, the normalcy, the embeddedness of firearms in everyday American life is something that has no Canadian equivalent. A gun shop next to a children's clothing store. Firearms in grocery stores in certain states. Concealed carry in a restaurant where you're having lunch. Open carry in a shopping mall. The conversation about guns in Canada is a policy debate. In America, it is an identity conversation, and the two things are completely different. Canadians who think they've understood American gun culture from the outside have understood the statistics without understanding what it means to live inside a culture where the right to bear arms is felt as personally as the right to speak. Canada has poverty. Canadians know this. They don't consider themselves naive about economic inequality, but the visible, structural, geographically concentrated poverty in parts of the United States is genuinely shocking to Canadians who encounter it for the first time. Not because Canada doesn't have struggling communities, it does, but because the American safety net works so differently, the gaps are so much wider, and the contrast between extreme wealth and extreme poverty is often physically located within blocks of each other in a way that Canadian cities rarely replicate. A Canadian who has watched American news for 20 years and thinks they understand poverty in the United States has understood the headlines. They have not understood the smell of a tent city 3 blocks from a luxury hotel, or what it means to live without any realistic prospect of healthcare in a country that considers itself the greatest on earth. That gap between what Canadians know and what they feel when they see it is significant. Canadian politics has left and right. There are debates, there are disagreements, there are people who feel strongly about policy. Canadians observe American politics and assume it's essentially the same thing, just more dramatic, more media-saturated, more performative. It is not the same thing. American political identity is tribal in a way that Canadian political identity simply isn't. In Canada, you can change your vote, hold mixed views, disagree with your party on specific issues, and it costs you nothing socially. In large parts of America, your political identity is a fundamental part of who you are. It determines your community, your friendships, sometimes your family relationships. The stakes feel existential in a way that Canadian politics does not. Canadians watching American political coverage think they're watching a more intense version of something familiar. They are watching something categorically different. Canadians have universal health care. They know Americans don't. They've heard the statistics. They understand intellectually that medical bills are a serious problem in the United States. But understanding it intellectually and understanding what it does to a person's daily psychology are completely different things. Americans make decisions about jobs, about relationships, about where to live, about whether to see a doctor, that are filtered through healthcare anxiety in a way that Canadians simply do not experience. An American who doesn't go to the doctor for something that concerns them because they can't afford the bill is not a news story. It is an everyday reality for tens of millions of people. Canadians who think they understand this because they've read about it have understood the policy without understanding what it feels like to carry that weight as background noise in every financial decision you make. The American drive to succeed, to build wealth, to achieve status, to win, is visible, unapologetic, and deeply culturally embedded. Canadians, who tend toward modesty and collective sensibility, often read this as greed, as selfishness, as a moral failing dressed up as aspiration. It isn't. The American relationship with ambition is genuinely different from the Canadian one, and it produces genuinely different things. Extraordinary innovation, extraordinary inequality, extraordinary individual stories of both success and failure. The Canadian tendency to interpret American ambition through a moral lens rather than a cultural one means they consistently misunderstand why Americans make the choices they make, why the American economy works the way it works, and why Americans don't want the Canadian model even when the Canadian model produces better outcomes on certain measures. Ambition in America is not a character flaw. It is a cultural value. Canadians who don't accept that will keep misreading Americans indefinitely. Canada is largely secular. Organized religion plays a much smaller role in Canadian public and private life than it did a generation ago. Canadians observe American religious culture, the megachurches, the faith-based politics, the casual reference to God in everyday conversation, and categorize it as a rural, southern, less educated phenomenon that doesn't represent the real America. This is a significant misreading. Faith is woven into American life across geography, class, education level, and political identity in ways that have no Canadian parallel. Highly educated Americans in major cities maintain sincere religious practice. American politics at every level references God in a way that would be unusual in Canadian public discourse. The assumption that religious America is somehow a fringe of the real America is one of the most common and most consequential mistakes Canadians make because it means they consistently fail to understand why tens of millions of Americans vote, live, and make decisions the way they do. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable point on this list, and I say it knowing it will generate the most pushback. Canadians, particularly progressive Canadians, believe that Americans secretly wish they had what Canada has: universal health care, gun control, a less polarized political culture, lower incarceration rates. They believe that if Americans just understood the Canadian model, they would want it. Most Americans don't want it, not because they haven't heard of it, not because they've been deceived by their media, but because the values that underpin Canadian social organization are genuinely different from the values that underpin American social organization. Americans who are given accurate information about the Canadian system and still prefer the American one are not confused. They have different values. Canadians who can't accept this haven't understood America. They've built a version of America that needs saving and then cast themselves as the ones who could save it. That is not understanding. That is projection. Canadians consume enormous amounts of American media. Netflix, HBO, network television, American news channels, American social media. From this consumption, they construct a picture of what American life looks, sounds, and feels like. The problem is that American media, particularly entertainment media, represents a highly specific, highly curated, geographically and demographically narrow slice of American experience. A Canadian who has watched 10 seasons of prestige American television has learned a great deal about what writers' rooms in Los Angeles think American life should look like. They have learned relatively little about what life actually looks like in Tulsa, or Scranton, or rural Mississippi, or suburban Ohio. The America that Canadians think they know from media is a produced version of America. The actual country is vastly more diverse, more complicated, more contradictory, and far less cinematically coherent than the version Canadians have been consuming for decades. Canada has regional differences. Quebec is distinct. Alberta and Ontario have different political cultures. Canadians understand that their country is not monolithic, but the scale and depth of American regional difference is something that consistently surprises Canadians who spend time there. Texas and Massachusetts are not just politically different. They are culturally, socially, economically, and in some ways linguistically different in ways that exceed the difference between Canada's most distinct regions. The American South is not a slightly different version of the American North. They have different histories, different relationships with the federal government, different food cultures, different social norms, different relationships with religion, race, and class. A Canadian who has visited New York and Miami and believes they understand America has visited two places on the American coasts that are, in important ways, the least representative parts of the country. This is the root of everything. Canada and America share a language, a border, a continent, a broadly Western cultural inheritance, and 2 centuries of deeply intertwined economic and social history. They are genuinely similar in many ways. And that genuine similarity is precisely what makes the differences so invisible and so consistently underestimated. When 2 things look nearly identical from a distance, the differences between them become harder to see than if they looked completely different. Canadians don't approach America the way they'd approach Japan or Brazil, with curiosity, with humility, with the assumption that they don't understand. They approach it as something familiar, and that familiarity is the single biggest obstacle to actually understanding it. The countries that are easiest to misunderstand are not the ones that are completely foreign. They are the ones that are almost the same. Canadian culture values collective well-being. The social contract in Canada is broadly understood to include things like healthcare, publicly funded education, and a reasonable safety net, not as charity, but as the basic terms of living in a society together. Americans prioritize individual rights, individual responsibility, and individual freedom in a way that Canadians consistently interpret as selfishness. It is not selfishness. It is a different and sincerely held set of values about what a society owes its members and what a person owes their society. An American who believes that their success is their own and that they should not be compelled to fund another person's health care is not a bad person. They are a person operating from a coherent value system that differs from the Canadian one. Canadians who can only read American individualism as moral failure have decided that the Canadian value system is the correct one and that Americans have simply failed to reach it. That is not cross-cultural understanding. That is condescension with good intentions. The final and most important point. Canadians have spent their entire lives living next to America. They have absorbed American culture, American media, American economics, American politics not by choice necessarily, but by geography. And from that long, close, involuntary immersion, they have concluded that they understand America. They understand American outputs. They understand what America produces, its culture, its politics, its economy, its foreign policy. What they have not understood, because proximity alone cannot give you this, is American interiority, what it feels like to be American. What the country means to the people who live inside it. The pride, the anxiety, the violence, the generosity, the contradiction, the genuine belief that this is the greatest country on earth, and the simultaneous awareness that it is falling short of what it should be. That is not something you can understand from next door. You have to go inside. So here is what we've established today. Canadians do not understand America. Not because they haven't tried, and not because they're not intelligent, but because similarity is the enemy of genuine understanding. The more familiar something looks, the less carefully you examine it. The most revealing thing about this entire dynamic is what it says about how all of us understand the world. We think we know the places we're closest to. We think exposure equals understanding. We think watching, reading, and listening from a distance gives us the same knowledge as living inside something. It doesn't. If you're Canadian and you disagree with any of this, I genuinely want to hear it. Put it in the comments. Tell me where I'm wrong. That conversation is exactly what this channel is for. You want to see the same analysis applied to what Australians get wrong about America? That video is coming. Subscribe so you don't miss it. See you in the next one.